Olá, Envie. Gostaríamos de iniciar essa conversa perguntando quais são os principais desafios para a democracia e os direitos sociais no mundo contemporâneo.
I think that what we're seeing all over the world is the emergence of new political formations that view democracy as the enemy of human rights, of the human condition, actually. And I think that we can identify some threads that are moving through this political formation that speaks in many ways to a recurrence, not in the most direct sense of fascism, but an updated notion of fascism. And it's a notion of fascism that begins by rewriting the narratives of history. And what that basically means is that it's a history that leaves out the genocide, the suffering, the exploitation, of fascist politics built upon militarism, ultranationalism, racial purity, and social cleansing. And I think that what's particularly interesting is that this new movement is updated not in the sense that it's reproducing different versions of what we might call elements of a fascist past, from the ultranationalism and militarism to massive degrees of global inequality, economic inequality. But it's aided now by cultural apparatuses in a digital world and modes of representation unlike we've ever seen before. So in a sense, you have two things going on that I think is very, very interesting. You have the merging in this moment, unlike in the 30s and the 40s. You have at one level, you have the crisis of neoliberalism. In other words, all over the world, neoliberalism has failed on its promises to basically increase social mobility and to decrease economic inequality. And it's produced massive degrees of misery, particularly around economic inequality and intellectual inequality, meaning that to the degree that people don't have the resources to basically find themselves in a world in which they can fulfill their multiple capacities to be critical agents, they find themselves, in a sense, unable to understand, because they don't have access to education, have access to these technologies, some of them, to basically understand the problems that they confront. Neoliberalism and these new political formations, right-wing authoritarianism, elements of a fascist policy, have stepped in and taken advantage of that misery produced by neoliberalism. And in a sense, it's addressed its legitimation crisis through a political crisis, meaning that it's now combined the basic elements of neoliberalism with, which is a form of economic authoritarianism, with a new form of political authoritarianism. And that political authoritarianism is basically all the elements of a fascist politics. So we now have people being mobilized through a culture of fear, a culture of hatred, a culture of dehumanization. And central to all of this is the notion of education as being central to politics itself. Because this is a war of ideas. This is not just a war over consciousness, it's a war over identity. It's a narrative that basically is saying that for all the misery that we're seeing through the massive degrees of inequality in the world, in particular forms of repression, the reason that we're having this is because we're being, in a sense, assaulted by refugees, people from the southern border, people who are considered disposable, so that the logic of disposability has been so expanded in this new moment that it's not just about Jews. I mean, it's not just about very limited populations. It's about anyone that doesn't fit into a white, nationalist, orphan Christian narrative. So it seems to me that what we're seeing, once again, to summarize this, right, is we're seeing a legitimation crisis that basically gives way to new forms of political authoritarianism. And these new forms of political authoritarianism constitute what I call neoliberal fascism. It's a new form of fascism. Out of the economic misery, out of the deprivation, out of the suffering, out of the inequalities, out of the deindustrialization, the destruction of the manufacturing sector, all of a sudden you have this global elite that has now consolidated its power and basically turned its attention to scapegoating populations all over the world who are no longer considered who are no longer considered necessary. That's something we haven't seen before on such a global scale. It's happening in Brazil. It's happening in Chile. The economic crisis in Chile now gives way to a fascist politics of oppression, right? We see it in the United States under Donald Trump. We see it under Erdogan in Turkey. We see it under Viktor Orban in Hungary. We see it in Poland. And what's interesting here, and something I've been thinking about, is on the 75th anniversary of Auschwitz, where the less than 200 survivors have gathered to basically say that this can never happen again. And how did it happen? How did people turn away? In the midst of that historical moment, frightening historical moment, and a testimony to moral witnessing and the need to develop a sense of historical consciousness, we all of a sudden find ourselves again in a period where historical consciousness is waning, where we're caught up in a culture of immediacy and consumption, where financial transactions eliminate any sense of ethical responsibility, where capital overrides the obligations of human rights. That's new, and it's very dangerous.
Você fala sobre neoliberalismo, fascismo neoliberal e o capitalismo fascista. A primeira onda fascista ocorreu após a Primeira Guerra Mundial, quando as ondas de capitais e as formas de fazer dinheiro pelo mercado especulativo se espalharam pelo mundo. Você tocou agora um importante ponto, que são as novas mídias e a nova cultura digital. Toda essa maquinária, as novas tecnologias de comunicação e informação, a expansão da internet, ainda não estavam massificadas no século XX. No entanto, elas são extremamente cruciais atualmente no século XXI, certo?
I mean, they're crucial because, you know, what's at stake here is the production of agents, modes of identification, values, social relations that are conducive to capitalism and increasingly conducive to a fascist politics, right? At one hand, you have these cultural apparatuses that basically make the claim that capitalism and democracy are the same thing, that make the claim that people basically don't need social spheres, that public goods are the enemy of democracy, that unions are worthless, that we don't need to invest in young people, that public goods are the enemy of the market, that the market is basically the sole arbiter for all social relations and not just economic relations, that self-interest is the only interest that matters, that privatization, standardization, deregulation, anything that basically supports the market is at odds with any interference under any situation from the state or from any other interest that might suggest that freedom is about more than market values and is about more than simply matters of financial exchange. So at one level, you have a form of neoliberalism that is so expansive and overwhelming in its reach and in its power economically that this constitutes a new political formation. What is new is that you have modes of legitimation that normalize neoliberalism in ways that function, I would say, on two registers. One, on one register, it makes the claim that the only obligation of citizenship basically is consumerism, shopping, and the privatization of everyday existence, right? So it individualizes the social. It depoliticizes people by leading them to believe that the only interest that they have are material interests, and that the only understanding of politics that they have is one that suggests that all problems are individual problems, and therefore they can't translate private interests into larger public considerations, right? The second issue is that it goes further, and it makes the claim that if you really want to look at the source of all problems outside of your own sense of an individual responsibility, then there is a notion of the social that we have to address. And that notion of the social is constituted by the language of pathology. It's constituted by the language of vermin. It's constituted by the language of hate. It's constituted by the culture of fear. It's constituted by the language of threats, dehumanization. And we have seen this before, but we've never seen it on such a global scale and with the power of a cultural apparatus concentrated in basically few economic hands to wield that power. I mean, the stories that are being produced, the narratives that are being legitimated, the social relationships that are being normalized, speak to a version of fascist politics that basically take the old notion of theater that we saw under Mussolini and under Hitler, and it's now not limited to individual rallies, you know, in Nuremberg, right, in Rome, or in Chicago, or in Florida. It's now global. It's on the screen. Theater is virtual. Learning is no longer simply something that takes place in the schools. And the new mode of learning is not what we learn, it's what we unlearn. It's what's to be forgotten, right? I mean, the lessons of history, all of a sudden, if they're not being rewritten, as in Poland, the Polish government passed a law saying any attempt to link the Polish government or Poland in general with elements of the Nazi Holocaust is illegal. Also, which was in Poland. I mean, this is where even the recurrence in remembrance of history gets punished, right? So I think that what we have seen is we have seen an economic system that moves by simply legitimating the market, and if that doesn't work, through outright forms of repression, to a system that now so relies on educational apparatuses, cultural apparatuses all over the world to normalize both its scapegoating of others and its basic tenets, that constitutes something very new. This integration of culture, power, and technology, the new technologies, constitutes a new educational sphere. Very powerful, very pervasive, very global.
É por isso que você afirma que o neoliberalismo tem sua própria pedagogia? Existe uma pedagogia neoliberal? Como a educação política pode tornar as pessoas mais fortes para que elas possam contestar e criticar esse sistema?
Mistake. It's an enormous mistake to operate off the assumption that the only tools of domination that we see under neoliberalism are economic or are repressive in the most immediate sense, through the courts, through the police, through the National Guard, through the army. Neoliberalism doesn't just produce structural apparatuses of power and repression. It also produces subjects. It produces modes of agency. It creates narratives. You have to have ideological links, it would seem to me, to be able to suggest a way of normalizing forms of oppression that people would no longer call into question. And I think that what we have seen, I mean, particularly in the UK, in the United States, is increasingly cultural apparatuses such as higher education, such as public education, such as the health services, such as government bodies that dispense knowledge and information. I mean, all of these channels in which knowledge is being produced, the way in which grants get set up, the way in which corporations offer knowledge to people around about themselves, their relationship to others in the world. I mean, these are all filtered through a neoliberal pedagogical apparatus. That's a teaching machine, and it teaches people to conform. It teaches people to basically believe that democracy is the enemy of the lives they lead. It teaches people to hate. It teaches people to reduce fear to simply a fear of the other. It teaches people to believe in borders. It teaches people to put up with, in the United States, putting young children in concentration camps. It teaches people to believe that when Bolsonaro says that Hitler was a communist, that's probably true. It teaches people to believe that when Boris Johnson appoints somebody in his cabinet who is basically a racist and claims that he believes in eugenics and that black people are less intelligent than white people, and that you should impose forced contraception upon the underclass because they reproduce in ways that suggest that they're a threat to the very notion of civilization. I mean, what you have is an ideological apparatus at work that's cementing, producing, legitimating modes of desire, particular kinds of social relations, particular kinds of values. You cannot talk about the new fascist politics without talking about education. You cannot talk about the institutions that neoliberal fascism creates to basically eliminate those institutions that make critical thinking possible and critical consciousness, as Freire would say, right? You can't talk about the rise of critical ideas if you don't have public institutions to produce them and support them. And the right knows this. The right and these new fascists understand that this war is not just simply over economic resources. It's also over, it seems to me, what it means to be able to colonize all those models of pedagogical education that have now come into play in the 21st century.
Então, de um lado, o neoliberalismo está atacando a cultura, acionando uma máquina para destruir a imaginação, que você chama de Disimagination Machine. E de outro lado, ataca-se diretamente os professores e o próprio sistema público de educação. Estamos atacando dos dois lados, certo?
Yes, I mean, this is a very important point, right? We're talking about a mode of repression and a war culture. Imagine this as a war culture. Imagine that these societies are being militarized in every way. They're being militarized by virtue of the fact that more money is being pumped into the military, more money is being pumped into the repressive state apparatuses, more money is being pumped into institutions that basically believe that human rights are not as important as the accumulation of capital and profit, whether on a global, federal, or national level. Right? At the same time, it seems to me they're pumping enormous amounts of money not only into the expansion of the carceral state, they're pumping an enormous amount of money into ways in which to destabilize and defund those democratic institutions, those institutions that are essential to democracy, public education, national health care, right, health services, social provisions, the ability to basically provide necessary aid to people who are who are on the margins of society, the need to attack economic inequality. So there's the second moment. That moment is you defund public goods to make them fail so that the market can then step in, privatize, deregulate, and operate without any fear of competition. Thirdly, it's attacking intellectuals. It's attacking those intellectuals and those elements of the press and the media that basically offer the opportunity to believe, in which they believe you can't have a democracy without informed citizens. I mean, we see it in Brazil, of course, under Bolsonaro, and we see it particularly in the United States under Trump, who makes no qualms about claiming that the press is the enemy of the American people. The enemy. I mean, this is the language of fascism, right? I mean, or we see it in Turkey, where over 500 academics and journalists have now been expelled from the country. For what crime? What's the crime? To speak to the truth? To hold power accountable? If those three elements aren't a basic register, an indication of the new fascism, then what is? And maybe another way of looking at this is to try to understand that fascism doesn't come overnight. It comes in accumulations. It comes in what I would call an accumulation of microaggressions. So first you put kids in internment camps. Secondly, you create a language of disposability and dehumanization, as in Brazil. Right? You claim that people who are basically poor are criminals, and then you go further. Then you shoot them from helicopters. Right? Then you do away with the press. You stop putting journalists in prison. So all of these, as Fintan O'Toole has suggested, the Irish reporter, these are trial runs. You see how far you can go. In the United States, you see a president who basically increases and updates almost every day the degree of lawlessness that he can impose. Now that he's been cleared of impeachment, he's now punishing those people, for instance, who testified against him, right? Firing Vindman, firing the UK, the ambassador to the European Union, You see a language of punitiveness now accelerating. You see a president who is claiming that he's above the law, that he can use the Justice Department to punish his political enemies. I mean, we've seen this before. Under Hitler, we had something called the Enabling Act, in which all of a sudden Hitler said, look, the courts don't matter anymore. I have power over the courts. That law is basically embodied in me, this right-wing populist leader. Ask yourself, where do we see this emerging again? But the thing that you really have to ask yourself is, how is it in the midst of so much misery, so much deprivation, so much poverty, so much suffering, that they become the answer for so many people? That's a pedagogical question. How do you learn to be a fascist? How do you learn to believe in scapegoating? How do you learn to believe that refugees who are fleeing from war-torn, bombed-out, utterly militarized, horrible situations are basically criminals? Trying to get a free pass into the United States, into France, into England, into Greece. What does it mean when you create societies based on borders, in which you not only incarcerate people, but you label them as vermin? The first step towards genocide, the end point of fascism, is genocide. Let's be clear, okay? Let's be clear about this. If you really want to talk about fascism, you have to talk about terror. Terror is the instrument of fascism. But terror doesn't any longer simply come in cruel acts of repression. It also now comes in reconfiguring modes of agency, identification, values, social relationships that make it possible, that allow people to not only to look away in the face of crime, criminology, violence, but also to become complicitous. To become complicitous. Intellectuals have become complicitous. Managerial types who do nothing but go to meetings and ignore linking education to enormously important social problems. Health workers who really believe that people who come in are poor are basically criminals. Doctors who believe that their medical ethics don't include people who don't fit into the register of racial purity. Evangelists who claim that they believe in justice and in God, but yet support dictators who basically violate human rights in every time they turn around. These are pedagogical questions. These are historical questions. These are questions about the apparatuses that create the agents that make this possible. This is the great challenge of the 21st century. And Marx basically didn't get it right. The issue is not the point is not to interpret the world but to change it. The point is to do both. The point is to basically, you can't understand the world, and if you can't change, you don't understand the world, you can't change it. Terry Eagleton got that right. He got it right. I mean, that's exactly right. So we have to prioritize the struggle over consciousness, while at the same time in thinking about ways in which we can understand these new political formations, which are not simply national. They're global. You have a global elite that has enormous amounts of power, that refuses to allow their industries to be taxed in nation states, deprive nation states of the economic funding they need to be able to function, and all of a sudden, what do these states turn to? They turn to repression. They turn to repression. They turn to scapegoating. They turn to the language of hate. So this is a very different political moment from that moment in which we saw the Bertrand Russells, the Paulo Freire's, the Mahatma Gandhis, right? The civil rights movements of the 1960s, the gay rights movements of the 1980s. Very different moment. And unless we understand the elements that shape this moment, we cannot strategize pedagogical and political formulations that are able to link national struggles with global struggles.
Se este é um problema pedagógico ou educacional, também precisamos pensar em termos de uma formação política, ou formação para a cidadania, como estratégia que a esquerda necessita usar para construir novas consciências e novas subjetividades. Sendo assim, qual seria o aspecto mais importante na educação política? Não só em termos de uma disciplina na escola, mas também por meio da ação de movimentos sociais e populares em instituições não formais? Quais são os principais desafios para o engajamento cívico e uma formação política crítica no mundo contemporâneo?
That's probably one of the most important political questions one can ask at this particular moment. So I really thank you for asking me that question. I mean, I think it's enormously crucial. And I think that we might begin by recognizing that all education is political. And all education is civic. Because all education, in a sense, doesn't take place in a vacuum, removed from the interconnections that allow us to both understand who we are and to address what it means to imagine a future that's better than the present. Right? So it seems to me, if we recognize the fact that all education is directive, that people actually intervene through various educational practices to create agents capable of making a democracy substantial, radical, and worthwhile, then we have to ask ourselves the second question, right? What's the vision of education that matters in this case? How do we want to imagine education in terms of what it's for? How do we want to imagine education as a project and a movement? Both. And it seems to me as a project, education has to be linked to questions of creating the agents that make a democracy possible. As a movement, it has to imagine all those places where education takes place. And it would seem to me that any place that education is central to shaping the values, the relationships, the identities, modes of identification, elements of agency that allow people to be in the world and to relate to themselves and others, become sites of intervention. Whether we're talking about the schools, whether we're talking about the media, whether we're talking about organizing at the level of everyday life, whether we're talking about any cultural apparatus that is engaged in modes of education, we have to see as pedagogical, we have to see in terms of pedagogical strategies in which people can occupy those places and use them. It seems to me that the next issue that we have to address around that pedagogical consideration is, how do we give people a vocabulary and a sense of what it means to take control of those institutions so that they have some control over their own labor in those institutions? In other words, what does it mean to link education to power, not just in terms of how it shapes modes of human consciousness, but how the people who basically are involved in education have the power to control it? How do we begin to attack, for instance, the neoliberalization of the university? How do we talk about policy in ways that reveals that those policies function to infantilize faculty, infantilize cultural workers, destabilize them, prevent them from writing, prevent them from acting, limiting the labor process so that, for instance, they become merely contractual workers? How do we link all of that to education so that we're talking about how power relations now become central to being addressed so that people can do the job they need to do in various agencies of education in order to be effective? The next question, it seems to me, is how do you talk about particular methods? How do you talk about a method by making it political rather than making it simply a recipe? How do you politicize methods? Right? I mean, how do you do that? I mean, how do you talk about, for instance, what does it mean to walk in? What do we do in a classroom? What do we do in a healthcare center? How do we talk to people? You know, how do we begin to imagine language as a tool that basically creates narratives that people can understand? What does it mean to make something, as I said, theory, resistance, and education 40 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. How do you make something meaningful in order to make it critical, to make it transformative? How do you do that? That's right from Paulo Freire, with a little Giroux added in, right? So it seems to me all of those elements now become crucial. But here's the one that seems to matter to me. How do you do that as a social movement as opposed to an individual act of teaching? How do you do that in ways in which people in schools can work together, right, to not only exercise their own collective power, but also to reach out into communities, as you do, into healthcare, around healthcare issues? How do you elevate education to a notion of the social, where education basically is about amplifying the social in order to give people power and to give them political and social rights, but more importantly, economic rights? You cannot talk about rights as purely political and personal. Sorry. You know, if I don't have the resources except to sleep under a bridge, do I really care about voting? Do I really care about the right of assembly? Do I really care about, do I have time to care about what it means to basically to work with other people? No, you don't have time. You're dying. I mean, that's the workstations of social death. How do you eliminate the workstations of social death? How do you do that, right? How do you eliminate the disimagination machines? How do you create a new language that opens up the contradictions that we see in this merging of institutions of repression with cultural apparatuses that create narratives that depoliticize people? How do you do that?
Na grande maioria das vezes, o seu trabalho fala sobre a capacidade de resistência, em que os agentes sociais trabalham de maneira coletiva contra as forças de opressão do sistema. Seja como movimento social ou agência coletiva, as pessoas estão sempre se perguntando como elas podem fazer isso. Também em nível micro, no seu cotidiano. Qual a importância dessa micropolítica para uma mudança efetiva?
I mean, I think that, you know, when you talk about micropolitics, ask yourself, how do microaggressions work? You want to begin with micropolitics? Begin with the micropolitics of justice. What does it mean in our particular classrooms? What does it mean in our particular meetings? What does it mean in our particular communities? What does it mean in all the interactions we have at the level of daily life to offer up models of resistance that make power accountable, that reverse the script, that give people a sense that in the institutions and everyday lives in which they find themselves, they can reimagine in some fundamental way how to challenge the microaggressions that they and their students or others experience every day. And how do we do that in a way that people can relate to in terms of the language that we offer them, in terms of their daily lives? I walk into a factory as a union organizer, and all of a sudden it's clear to me that people are working 15 hours a day under conditions that are horrendous. They can't even go to the bathroom because of the regulations. They have to, only go to the bathroom twice a day. They're working 18 hours. They're not being paid properly. That's what we want to talk about. I don't want to talk about abstractions such as global capitalism right now. I want to talk about what does it mean to be able to challenge these? What strategies can we develop? How can I, as an organizer, help them develop those strategies? How can we learn from each other? How do we promote a dialogue at those levels that produce new forms of resistance that are contextual? All resistance is contextual. It begins with context, meaning that it begins with instances of repression that people just don't hear about, they feel. What does it mean to understand repression as partly affective? An emotional injury that people wear but can't articulate. How do you begin to combine an articulation of that injury with the injury itself? And then what do you do about it? In some cases, people would say, well, you need very specific answers here. Tell me what exactly to do. Actually, I'm not going to tell people exactly what to do. What I'm going to say is that in the context in which you find yourself, which I don't know about, there are instances that you have to begin to reimagine about what you can learn from history, what you can learn from others, what you can learn about the context in which you find yourself, in which you can challenge the everyday microaggressions, elements of fascist politics that go on by actually working with other people in dialogue and in community to address those issues. Whether it's producing a new curriculum, whether it's cutting back on fighting to cut back class sizes, whether it's challenging policy formations and policies themselves that are oppressive, whether it means, like we saw in the United States, teachers in the United States, in many states, going on, ignoring their unions, no less, and going into the streets and taking direct action against governments and saying, hey, sorry, state governments, saying, sorry, this is not just about increasing our pay. We need more social workers. We need smaller classes. And to making an appeal to their most immediate needs in ways to suggest these don't just benefit them, they benefit everybody. Because to the degree to which you accentuate the deprivations that mark the social sphere, is the degree to which the social becomes an element of resistance that everyone has to address.
Uma pergunta bem direta sobre os objetivos da resistência. Democracia radical ou revolução?
They're the same. There's no difference between a radical democracy. A democracy is radical because it means that the revolution never ends.
Poderia, por favor, expandir um pouco sua ideia de revolução?
Revolution means that you go to the roots of a problem and the changes that you argue for are not cosmetic, they're fundamental. They're fundamental. You know, we're not talking about adding band-aids to a system in order to make it perform better. We're talking about destroying the system. I mean, for me, to be very honest with you, capitalism is the most evil system that's ever been produced because its endpoint is fascism. You know, it may create markets that increase production and the circulation of goods, but ultimately we know where it ends. Brecht was right on this. Adorno was right. You want to know about fascism? Study capitalism. You know? So it seems to me that when I talk about revolution, I'm talking about a revolution that functions at two levels. I'm talking about a revolution in thought that can make the connection between fascism and capitalism and the horrible misery and destruction it does globally, everything from destroying the planet to destroying human lives, to basically the need to say, okay, we can't live with this anymore. This has to change. We have to change the economic structure with the political structure, the notions of power that informs it, the kinds of agencies it produces, and the institutions that make life possible in a democratic way. You know, to be very simple, if you want to talk about a revolution, go back to Greece. Demos, right? You bring people together. People have to have power. Without power, there's no democracy. Without collective power. And so if you're going to have collective power, you're going to have a revolution because you're going to overthrow those structures that prevent that power from being distributed in ways in which people can actually exercise it. I don't believe any longer in reform, except in the most immediate sense. I must tell you, the debate about reform versus revolution is a false debate, in my estimation. Reform should always have as its endpoint revolution, meaning that I can believe in immediate reforms in which people who are dying, who don't have food stamps, who don't have health care, yes, those reforms should be fought for every day, but never with the assumption that that's all we need. Always with the assumption that they are just one small step in restructuring the system so that you don't have to think about reform. That's what revolution is. It's a discourse without reform. It's a discourse that doesn't believe in reform because it's not necessary. But it's a discourse that also believes that justice never goes far enough. So the revolutionary process is endless. You can't have a revolution without endless forms of self-examination. You can't have a revolution without endless forms of questioning and inquiry. You can't have a revolution that believes in what Robert J. Lipton calls ideological totalism. No revolution is complete. And any revolution that says it's complete is no longer revolutionary. It's now become another form of authoritarianism. It's never complete. No society is ever just enough. You know? That doesn't mean that all forms of authoritarianism are the same, but ideological totalism, which only operates off the assumption of binaries, good and evil, right? People who belong and people who don't, people who are ideologically incompatible with us and people who aren't. It's just bullshit. It's a form of corruption, and it can corrupt anybody. You know, as Paulo used to say, authoritarianism isn't just on the right? I mean, but those of us who are on the left, rather than embrace authoritarianism, have a responsibility to consistently fight against its micro-corruptions. Fair enough?
Na semana passada, o Papa Católico Francisco recebeu o ex-presidente brasileiro Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva e os dois conversaram sobre a bem-sucedida experiência brasileira de distribuição de renda conhecida como Bolsa Família. Enquanto a Europa estava implantando um modelo de austeridade fiscal defendido por Angela Merkel, o presidente Lula afirmava que colocar dinheiro nas mãos dos pobres era a melhor solução para a crise econômica. Enquanto toda a Europa se afundava, o Brasil saía da crise sem qualquer problema. Lula e o Papa falam de uma economia social, ou seja, uma economia não inteiramente voltada ao lucro. Com o avanço das reformas neoliberais e do corte dos direitos sociais desde o início do século XXI, o capital está cada vez mais concentrado nas mãos de uma pequena elite e a economia está estagnada ou em crise, numa escala global. O que você pensa desta perspectiva de distribuição das riquezas com a base social da pirâmide populacional?
It's a model we've seen before in a time of economic crisis, right? I mean, we saw it in the United States with the New Deal, you know, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was forced, in many ways, by workers and communists to basically implement reforms because he was afraid that if he didn't do it, they would win. You know, I mean, this was an attempt to basically shore up the system, not an attempt to basically implement modes of justice that would call it into question. The issue here is modes of intervention that don't call the system into question, but basically believe you can modify the system to make it more just. In the long run, reproduces the system. Even when it comes from the Pope, whom I like. You know, I love Lula, right? But, you know, beneath their discourse is the spirit of revolution. But in their discourse is the spirit of reform. And they're at odds with each other.
Maybe that's why, because the Workers' Party were interrupted. No, they were not on revolution. They were
they're not
reforms.
revolutionaries. I mean, we saw this in Syriza in Greece. They talk in the spirit of revolution, in weak but still, and they end up basically accommodating to the demands of global capitalism. I don't want a language that accommodates global capitalism. I don't want a language that, as moderate as it appears, in the end reinforces the fascist politics. I'm sorry. And I think that for those of us who believe that, and I certainly do not hold myself up as an icon for this in any way whatsoever, but you got to have courage, you know? You got to take risk. You know what I mean? We don't have a lot of time left on this planet. I mean, we as Noam Chomsky has pointed out, we have governments in power now that are more dangerous than they were under Hitler. They're more dangerous because you're not just talking about the extermination of 11 million people. You're talking about the death of the planet. You're talking about the death of millions. You're talking about a global capitalism that can't deal with pandemics, doesn't have the right resources. So now you have in China what we're seeing. We're all interconnected. Capitalism doesn't believe we're interconnected except for financial services. But if we're interconnected around the possibility of human rights, we're interconnected around the possibility of social and economic justice, if we're interconnected around the possibility of democracy that's global and not just based in particular states, nation states, this is a new kind of struggle. Demands a new kind of language. Doesn't demand the language of reform, right? I mean, it seems to me that the political formations that we're dealing with have exhausted any notion of reform and now have no interest in them. Now you have the heavy hand of fascism. So how do you talk about reform without talking the failure of reform, without talking about fascism? How do you talk about revolution without talking about reforms as a mode of fascism? The soft mode of fascism. You know, fascism has two forms of violence. The slow violence. The violence that hides beneath the obvious. You know, the violence of increased poverty. The violence in which families have to choose food over medicine. You know, the violence of everyday humiliations in dealing with social services, right? The violence of having to drink water filled with lead. Then there's the hard violence. You know, the violence of state repression. Reform is the violence, is slow violence. Revolution is revolutionary thinking doesn't just concern itself with hard violence, state repression. It concerns itself with slow violence. And if you're going to concern yourself with slow violence, you have to deal with reforms and what they mean. And to be able to understand what in the long run they produce and legitimate.
Avançando na reflexão sobre o pensamento revolucionário, gostaríamos que você comentasse o fato de que o socialismo, ao menos tal como temos visto sendo implantado até agora, não foi capaz de ser desenvolvido de uma maneira democrática. Nós poderíamos abordar alguns países como Cuba, Venezuela, Rússia, Coreia do Norte e China, que são países com um predomínio do pensamento socialista, mas que adotaram um sistema pouco democrático. Então,
they talk about socialism when it's infused with modes of political authoritarianism. That's not socialism. I mean, that's a weak form of social democracy. That's the face of social democracy that hides the underlying foundations of fascist politics. So, I mean, it's easy to blame socialism for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's to claim that people get cancer because they want to. You know, they want to be sick, right? I mean, look, I mean, we know that there are social democracies that are close to socialism, and we know that in some places, like whether we're talking about Finland, we're talking about the Scandinavian states, we see a level of equality that is productive, but they don't go far enough. You know what I mean? The key here is how do we invent a democratic notion of socialism that learns from the past, takes the most radical ideas that we can, and implements them in a context in which people have power, people have political rights, people have social personal rights, and people have economic rights. If you want to talk about socialism, you don't need a recipe. You need a way of refiguring how the basic tenets of socialism work in the context of a new historical period.
parece que o capitalismo adotou uma nova forma no século XXI, que nós estamos chamando de neoliberalismo, certo? Então, talvez o socialismo pudesse assumir também uma outra forma, inclusive recriando o conceito para o século XXI, né?
All ideologies breathe with the possibility of justice. Only if they can situate themselves and update themselves in the context in which they find themselves. I mean, any ideology, and socialism included, that models itself after the 19th century or the 18th century is not a legacy vibrant with potential. It's a legacy that's dead to the past, right? I mean, but this is exactly what the enemies of communism and socialism do. I mean, what they say is, oh, that's an historic relic. It has no relevance for, and actually one might say it has more relevance today in its updated forms. Its attacks on finance capital, inequality, on the discourse of human rights. And then you ask yourself, you know, in what way, in the context in which, I mean, what does it mean to talk about socialism in Venezuela, where there's enormous amounts of inequality, right, as opposed to socialism in the United States, where there's enormous amounts of wealth? How do the basic attributes of socialism get refigured and then play out so as to understand how power can be used economically, politically, socially, in ways to be able to create the foundations for a socialist society? And what do you mean by a democratic socialist society? What you mean is that power is distributed and resources are distributed and rights are distributed in which people have some control over their lives in the name of the public good. Right? Compare that to neoliberalism and its basic assumptions. Compare that to the logic of the market. Compare that to the hate-mongering of fascist politics. These are very different models. Socialism begins with justice. Capitalism begins with profits. Fascism begins with genocide and racial purity.
Essa é certamente uma boa comparação. Estamos quase terminando a nossa entrevista. Temos somente mais duas questões. Como nós podemos trabalhar com a ideia de esperança, no sentido que ela possa estar conectada não só com a percepção de sujeitos individuais, mas também com práticas sociais e lutas coletivas mais amplas?
I mean, imagine the notion of hope as a kind of imagination on steroids. I don't think you can talk about revolution. I don't think you can talk about justice. I don't think you can talk about the future if you can imagine something quite different from the situation in which you experience and find yourself. And it seems to me that imagination is the engine of hope. Because if you can't think otherwise, you can't act otherwise. And so it seems to me that hope is not some romanticized, Disneyfied notion of innocence in which everything will be wonderful because all you have to do is sit back and wait for it to happen. Hope, it seems to me, is a mode of inspiration and a condition for, in some way, engaging the realities in which you find yourself that prevent hope from actually being fulfilled. Hope is a condition of agency. Without hope, you have no agency. Without agency, you have no hope. They inform each other. So what we're talking about when we talk about hope is we're talking about a theoretical position in which one refuses to live in the present and assume that that's all there is. Hope is a condition that says that outside of the present, there is another world, and you have to fight for it, individually and collectively. But hope doesn't come by virtue of a wish. Hope comes by virtue of having access to information. Hope comes by virtue of being able to look into the past and to see how people struggled to basically change the worlds in which they find themselves. Hope comes in the examples of people who produce new narratives and give us a sense of what's possible. Hope comes in those institutions that say, you're more than what you are. You can do more, but we have to do it collectively. Hope comes when it aligns itself with justice rather than romanticizes justice. You know, hope comes in the notion of struggle. You can't have hope without struggle, and you can't have struggle without education, and you can't have justice without all of those things.
Apenas uma última questão sobre o futuro. Você recentemente escreveu um artigo com a doutora Hania Filippaco, da Brunel University, e falaram muito sobre a esperança no futuro. Vocês expressaram bons argumentos sobre o futuro, refletindo sobre guerras, paz e escolhas futuras. Poderia comentar essas ideias?
I think that what we were both trying to work through were three things. One is, how do you connect hope with the notion of agency that in some ways speaks to a future very different from the present? Secondly, how do you connect hope to struggle? What is the relationship between hope and struggle? Right? How, and what does it mean to go beyond the privatized struggles of neoliberalism with their shaming and their individualizing of the social and their refusal to translate private issues into larger public considerations? And so it became clear, it was at least in the pieces we were trying to develop it, that you had to link hope to collective struggles. That this is, hope was the foundation for struggle, not just the foundation for wishing about or dreaming about a different future. Hope is not just about dreams. Central to hope is the notion of the struggle for the things you believe in that are possible and to recognize the forces that you have to confront. Thirdly, it seems to me we were concerned about how public institutions such as higher education have in some way occupied a central role in illuminating hope and endlessly function on the side of cynicism by virtue of, for instance, the endless support for turning education into the culture of business, the rise of managerial modes of operating the university. And what was the responsibility of public intellectuals in all of this? You know, in developing new discourses of hope. And so it seems to me in those three registers we were trying to articulate in embryonic form a script of some sorts for rethinking hope in ways that appropriated it on the side of struggle, on the side of justice, and I must say, on the side of revolution.